Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. I'm delighted to be able to bring to you today a very special guest, an old friend of mine. I think we first met in 2008, is that right? Pastor Rich Lusk. Welcome to the podcast, Rich.
Yeah, great to be with you, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Just give us the 30-second version of who you are, where you are, what occupies you during the week.
Yes, so I am the pastor of Trinity Presbyterian Church. We are a CREC congregation in Birmingham, Alabama. And I've been here now actually for over 20 years. It's amazing how quickly the time flies by. So I've been married to Jenny for 30 years. We've got 4 grown children, 3 married, 1 engaged, a couple grandkids. So God's been very good to us. Very, very thankful.
Wonderful. That's great. It's great. Well, one of the things I've always admired you from afar for, Rich, and I don't think I've ever mentioned this to you, is the way that you seem to just plug away very, very diligently in the local church. I say just, I mean that gloriously plug away diligently in the local church. And in the process, you produce really high quality teaching material. You're a pastor scholar, as I view from afar. And obviously, you've written a few books. Some people will know you from those books, Paid of Faith being one that I've shared with a number of people here. But one of the things that sometimes happens is clearly somebody pokes you on a subject, like the subject we're going to be talking about today, and that prompts you to produce not just a sermon or two, but some fairly voluminous papers and articles where I don't know whether you're just trying to get it off your chest or whether this is, I think it's admirable, and I think it's really profoundly helpful for the broader church. And that's why I'm so pleased to bring you on to talk about the subject of head coverings, 1 Corinthians 11 today. And we were just chatting about this before.
Just a light topic.
Well, it was funny. So I've done 2 podcasts on this already. And the first one I introduced by highlighting how it came about. We do have about maybe 8, 10, 12 ladies in our church who cover their heads with some kind of fabric or scarf or head covering of some kind during worship. That's probably... it's actually a very small proportion. But we've been blessed with significant growth in recent months and years. And one or two people have asked, our new people have asked questions about this. And one gentleman said, quick question to the guys on the men's group chat. Why do you all, some of your wives do this? And I just thought that was quite funny. Quick question about head covering. So, I mean, the first thing and this is just to recap for those who are tuning in this time and haven't listened to the previous couple, you might want to go and do that. And in the first one, I pointed out that this is not a simple question. It sometimes seems like a simple question because well-intentioned, thoughtful, godly, faithful Christian men and women just read 1 Corinthians 11 verse 5. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovers dishonors her head. And it's like, well, I don't want to do that. So that seems fairly clear. But the complexity pretty soon becomes apparent if you dig into the text. And I gave a couple of examples of that in the first podcast. Then the second one, I just wanted to draw attention to some cultural issues. And the point I really wanted to make in that was, let's assume for a moment that I were persuaded that in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul was telling the Corinthians that they ought to follow this practice. Would it follow from that we ought to do the same thing? And maybe it would, or maybe it wouldn't. But that statement presupposes some claims about the relevance of first century cultural expressions of submission, if that's what it is, and I'm not sure necessarily that it is, but anyway, to today's world. And I just highlighted the difficulty of answering that question by pointing out that there are other cultural practices from the ancient world, like foot washing and exchanging a sandal at the ratification of a contract, or placing your hand under somebody's thigh when making a promise, that we don't tend to transfer quite so neatly into the present day. Now, that's not to trivialize the issues of first century cultural practices. It's merely to point out that we do make assumptions about their relevance. If we thought that 1 Corinthians 11 taught this, those questions would become important. But what I want to talk with you about today, Rich, is your view of the exegesis of 1 Corinthians 11, which I find persuasive and compelling and helpful, because in the end, this is where it's got to begin and end. We need a view of this practice which is not trying to guesstimate our way around cultural differences, but is seeking to be faithful to the Word of God. So I wonder if you could you just flesh out for us or summarize for us what your take on this passage is, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so thank you for what you said about my work in the local church. And speaking of pastor scholars, I don't know if I do qualify for one or not, but you most certainly do, Steve. So greatly appreciate your work and glad to be here with you today. Let me preface everything, and I think this fits well with what you just said and what your practice is there in your local church. I think it would be very unwise, and I think it would be really unfortunate if this became a highly divisive issue in our churches. My church, it actually sounds like our situation is a lot like yours. We got a handful of women, just a smattering of women here and there who at some point in the last few years started wearing head coverings because their husbands wanted them to, and it was because of their understanding of this passage. And I don't object to that. I've not tried to get anybody to stop doing it. The one thing I have said is, obviously we have core beliefs that you have to adhere to be a member of our church. Those are summarized in our membership vows. But outside of that, there can be a range of views on any number of what I might call secondary or tertiary issues. And this would be one of them, where I think that you've got good people on different sides of this debate, whether or not the woman should wear an artificial head covering. You got good people on both sides of this discussion. I've noticed on X that when this comes up, it's kind of like the baptism debates. I mean, you've got people who are very entrenched in their position, and in some cases, probably haven't thought through the issues with the kind of detail and depth that they really should give it. But it's the internet, so what do you expect? But yeah, so asking about the cultural question. So I've done quite a bit of research on that, and there are certainly conflicting views that historians and other scholars have about how women dressed and whether or not they wore head coverings in daily life, much less church life, in the first century context. But from what I can tell, the best scholarship indicates that wearing an artificial head covering was not common practice in first century Corinth. It wasn't something that was typically done. And we could discuss how much that should factor into our reading of the text. I think the text has to stand on its own. I don't think, I will add this to that, whether they wore head coverings or not, whether that was a common practice in the ancient Greco-Roman context in first century Corinth, I don't think what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 11 can be dismissed as merely cultural. So, for example, I don't think we could say, Paul's commanding them to do something, but we don't have to do it because that was then and this is now, because our culture is different. And I say that because Paul seems to be rooting his argument, whatever that argument is, whatever he's arguing for, he grounds it in really a theology of the sexes, which goes back to creation. So he has quite a bit to say about the creation account, and this is maybe a side note for this discussion, but it's still really important. Paul took the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2, not as some kind of myth or symbolic account, but as history. So the man was made first and then the woman, every attempt to reconcile the Bible with any kind of evolutionary theory, some kind of theistic evolution accommodation to Darwinism crashes against those rocks. Paul does this again and again. Jesus actually does the same thing when he makes his appeals to the creation account. Paul took it as history. And so Paul's appeal here is partly to Genesis 2 and partly to what he calls nature. Now, nature is a very broad category, and that word nature, I think, is one of the hardest words to pin down in the entire New Testament because it can be used in so many different ways. And I think we have to understand. So it's not enough to just say, oh, we know what nature means. You've got to know what it means in this particular context, because even Paul himself will use that term nature in very versatile ways. And it doesn't always have the exact same meaning for Paul. It's highly contextualized.
Just flesh that out for us for a moment, because I'd be interested to hear whether your view of the spectrum of possible meanings is the same as mine, or whether you've spotted things that I've missed on the meaning of nature in the New Testament.
Well, yeah, so I've done a study of this. I found at least 5 different shades of meaning to the term nature. in the New Testament. I think the simplest way to understand it, and maybe the other aspects of what nature means are kind of derivative of this. Nature simply means God's creational design. So, for example, in Romans chapter 1, Paul describes sodomy as unnatural. It's contrary to God's creational design. It's an improper use of our bodies. It's an improper use of our sexuality. It goes contrary to the kind of sexual practices God made us for. So, that's the most basic meaning. It's rooted in creation. Now, in Romans chapter 2, Paul links. He talks about those who are circumcised by nature. So there is something, and I think there he's talking about Jewish nature. The Jewish people are marked out as a specific people. There's a kind of nature to the Jewish community, and they are identified by the males being circumcised. So that'd be a broader term. But even there, I don't think it simply collapses into culture. As if it's just a matter of custom. I don't think nature's synonymous with custom anywhere.
Right.
There are other uses. James talks about the nature of different animals and that kind of thing. If I remember his usage. So it seems to tie back into creation design. Now, it can also describe what we are by nature after the fall. So there's that element to it as well. And that may factor into the way at least some people read what's happening in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Because one question I have, so Paul talks about how and I want to get the passage in front of me so I don't butcher it. But Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 11, he talks about this in the context of shame. How she dishonors her head if her head's not covered. And we can get into the praying and prophesying and that kind of thing because that factors into the discussion as well. But one question I have is if a woman's longer hair is not a sufficient covering, which he does towards the end of the passage say God has given to her hair as a covering. And I tend to take that as like a comprehensive statement, like that's a sufficient covering. She doesn't need an additional covering. But if she did need an additional covering, and it's shameful for her to not have one, whether you're talking about daily life or in the sanctuary, one question that I would have is, well, was Eve, she wasn't named Eve yet, but the woman in Genesis 2, was she created in a state of shame? Because she didn't have a head covering. And even after God clothes them in Genesis chapter 3, there's nothing about, they've covered themselves with fig leaves. God slaughters an animal. It's the first blood sacrifice we have in the Bible. And then he covers them, but we're not told anything about her head being covered. And further, there's nothing in Torah that obviously points to this. So my question would be, if you want to argue that the artificial covering is a requirement, I would ask the question, when did it become a requirement? When did this become something that was shameful for a woman to not have this additional artificial covering? And why is that needed in addition to the cover that God has given her by nature, which would be her longer hair? And what complicates that, or what I think further raises it raises the question or reinforces the question, is you've got passages like 1 Timothy chapter 2, which is also in the context of a worship service. So that's another thing. There are debates about the context of 1 Corinthians 11. Is it talking about daily life? That doesn't seem to be the case. Is it talking about some kind of gathering of Christians outside of an official worship service? There's like what we might call a small group or a Bible study or prayer meeting. There's some who have taken that view. Or is it talking about the gathered liturgy, which is, I think it's talking about a formal gathering of the church. And the next topic he goes into is the Lord's Supper. And I think he's just continuing to talk about their worship practices, their liturgical practices. So here he's really dialed in on talking about the relationship of men and women in the context of the liturgy. Paul's doing the same thing in 1 Timothy chapter 2, but there he commands women to not have these overly ostentatious hairstyles. Well, if a woman's hair is going to be covered anyway, why give that command? Now, if her longer hair is her covering, it makes sense why he would give that command. And especially if her hair is her glory, why she might want to glorify it even further, and kind of go overboard, the way Paul warns against in 1 Timothy chapter 2.
Yeah, I mean, you could go even further, couldn't you? You could say Paul's writing to Timothy would be much simpler if he just restated there the women should be covering their hair command with a fabric or artificial covering, if that was what he had in mind. So the absence of this command from other parts of New Testament teaching about worship is actually quite striking, if that's what it is about in 1 Corinthians 11.
Right. If this was a custom of all the churches, we seem to see instruction elsewhere. So when I say this, I mean having an additional covering over the hair, some kind of additional head covering, veil, whatever it might have been. If there's something additional to her hair, that just doesn't seem to fit well with what we've got in 1 Timothy chapter 2, which is also talking about worship. You could also go to 1 Peter chapter 3, where Peter's got something to say about this. But 1 Timothy 2 is most relevant because it is also about worship. And why bother? Why not just say, hey, don't leave your head covering at home. Remember to bring it, and then it doesn't matter what you've done with your hair underneath because nobody's going to see it anyway.
Right. I just want to drop a footnote in here about nature, and if I can find time to get you back on the podcast in a few months' time when you've got another 45 minutes spare, we will talk about. I want to talk about natural law, and just to alert folks who are listening to the danger of equating nature with the capacity that we have to perceive what is going on in nature around us. If nature can refer to somebody being circumcised by nature, then clearly it's broader than the general revelation as such.
Right.
And there's a whole rabbit trail we should go down there, but not today.
I would love to do that. So let's get together and do that. That'd be very worth it.
Well, I want to read verses 13 to 15 in the ESV, and then I'm just going to get you to summarize, for the sake of clarity, your view. Then let's jump into your paraphrase, because I find that really helpful way of elucidating what some of the tricky issues are. So, verse 13, this is Paul. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So just riff on that, Pastor Lusk, and tell us the outline of your view here.
Yes. So what Paul is getting at in terms of his overarching argument here is that there are differences between men and women. There's a peculiar masculine glory that belongs to men and a peculiar feminine glory that belongs to women. And not only that, but of course, he says earlier, man is the image and glory of God. The woman is the glory of the glory of the man. And I think what he is highlighting here is how the sexual differentiation that God has built into the human race should be manifested in various ways in the context of worship. And so, the way I've put this before, I've said, men should act and speak and dress like men, and women should act and speak and dress like women. Now, we talked about culture earlier, how that comes to expression will have a lot of cultural variation within the parameters of God's creational design. So it's not a free for all, but neither is it a straitjacket. There's a range within which of what you could call sexual expression for men and women. So these are not like rigid stereotypes. It's more like it's not a pinpoint, it's a box. And within this box, this is how women can express themselves in a feminine way. And within this box, this is how men can express themselves in a masculine way. So I think that's a big part of what he's doing here. And I think, so it's interesting because you have to take this passage in conjunction with what Paul says later on about the sexes in worship in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, which is another not so simple passage to deal with. But there he's also taking up this topic of sexual differentiation within the worship service. And one thing that you see, so basic principle that comes out, I think it's embedded in this passage, but it's explicit in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, is that liturgical leadership is masculine. Liturgical leadership is masculine. And so, and that is because, and I think where a lot of the broader evangelical church goes wrong with its worship, it's not merely that they have a deficient understanding of male and female. They also have a very deficient understanding of what's actually happening when we gather for church or as the church, when in an official assembly of God's people. And the reason I say that is because I think a lot of people don't understand what's really happening in the service. The pastor, so I imagine you guys do something similar. When I am officiating a worship service, when I'm officiating the liturgy, I wear an alb with a stole, and that marks me out. What's it marking me out? What is it marking me out as, or what is it marking me out to do in that context? Well, it's marking me out as a special representative of God the Father and Jesus the Son. It's marking me out as a special representative of Jesus to his bride, the church. And so, for example, in the context of the Sunday worship service, when we confess our sins, and then I declare absolution, I am declaring God's forgiveness to the people. And I am dressed in such a way as to remind people I'm not just doing this as a private person, though certainly Christians can forgive one another's sins and give one another God's promise of forgiveness. But in that context, I am doing so as a special representative of the Lord Jesus Christ. One of the reasons, this would not be the only reason, but one of the reasons only men can be pastors is because the pastor represents Jesus to the bride. And to put a woman in front of the congregation to engage in liturgical leadership would be to, as C.S. Lewis says, you're basically changing religions at that point because you're changing gods. God has revealed himself in the Bible not as male, certainly, but as masculine. And so his specially ordained representatives must be masculine as well. And when we gather, the congregation is feminine in the sense that the congregation is in a receptive posture and is receiving what God offers to them and gives to them through his ordained representative. So I think that's really, really important to understand as sort of background. And that I think helps explain a lot of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, or really 1 Corinthians chapter 14, about what women can't do. He doesn't, right. He says women are to be silent. He says this is according to the law, and that's another interesting question: is what law does he have in mind? I think it's not limited to, but certainly includes Genesis chapter 2, where you could say Adam is the first pastor and Eve is the first congregation, and that's really where this pattern is established. And so what's happening here at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is Paul is basically saying for a woman to lead the assembly, she would have to do so. She would have to masculinize herself.
Right.
And Paul is showing that is inappropriate. So if she were to shave her hair, because, a lot of us guys, we go bald. Whether
really?
we want to or not. Yes. That's
Who knew?
Yes, who knew? Or she'd have to shave her head short like a man. Okay. So one of the ways that the differences between men and women come to expression is via hair.
Yeah,
right? And we intuitively recognize that. And when you have a culture where, like if you see somebody from the back and you don't know if it's a man or a woman, that is a problem. That's a problem just as much as transvestism is a problem. Like if a man's dressing like a woman, or so that's the kind of thing Paul's getting at. Is there was obviously we don't know exactly all the details of what was going on in Corinth, but there was a lot of sexual confusion. A lot of confusion about sex as intercourse, but also a lot of confusion about the sexes, male and female. And Paul is trying to set them straight. And so, we don't know if Corinthian women were trying to usurp positions of leadership in the worship service, but whether they were or not, Paul here is shutting all of that down and saying it would be shameful for a woman to take on a man's appearance and to take on a man's role and to assert herself as you could say as a liturgical leader in the assembly. He goes on in verse 14 and he says, does not nature, and here I do think nature is functioning more or less as God's creational design, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace for him? Now the exception there obviously would be the Nazarite, because a Nazarite would take a vow where among other things he would not cut his hair, but that's an exception that proves the rule kind of thing.
Exactly. If guys wore long hair normally, then what's the Nazarite being?
What's the Nazarite vow? Exactly.
Told to grow his hair long hair.
Right. It doesn't make any sense. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace for him because he's become like a woman? But if a woman has long hair, that is her glory. It's an expression of her feminine glory. So again, the sexes should be distinguished. They should be distinguished by their appearance. They should be distinguished in their role. And for a woman to take on the appearance of a man, which one way she could potentially do that is by cutting her hair short like a man, that would be shameful because it's an act of rebellion against God's creational design for the sexes.
Oh,
And
that's interesting.
and he goes on to say her hair is given to her for a glory and a covering. And I really, people will make hay out of the fact, and I didn't look at the Greek text before this, so I can't. My memory on this is a little bit fuzzy, but the word for covering there is different than the word earlier in the passage. But just because he uses a different word does not mean there's not some kind of connection. And I take him here to be saying that her long hair is a sufficient covering. She doesn't need some additional covering. And if she chooses to wear one, fine. But that's in the category of adiaphora, not something that is required.
Right. It's interesting just to reflect a little more on the glory, hair, covering, and the masculinity, femininity nexus. It's striking that Absalom, who ends up seeking to usurp David's kingdom, is remarked upon for his long hair. And in Hebrew, and I know you know this, Rich, the way that long hair is described is using the adjective heavy. And
right.
adjective glorious. Heavy, kavod, also means glorious.
Yeah.
So what's actually happening is, in a context where men customarily wore short hair because the Nazarite would stand out for having his long hair, Absalom is feminizing himself with this glorious long flowing locks of hair, which are his glory. He is breaking the gender or sex distinctives from the other direction, and that's highlighted in connection with his ungodly quest for power and so on. So and
it is his undoing.
Right. And so when it says a man ought not to cover his head because he's the image of and glory of God, woman is the glory of man. What it is that makes a man glorious is that his wife is beautiful and has long hair, right? Not that exactly he calls attention to himself. I mean, and this is now another step sideways, but it highlights the ways in which some of these cultural distinctives really do pervade daily life. I remember a good friend of mine here at the church remarking he's got several sons, and he said, but I don't much care what my boys do with their hair as long as it only takes them 30 seconds to do it.
Right.
Whereas I've got a son and two daughters, and I don't mind if the girls spend 10 minutes doing their hair on a Sunday morning. I do not want my son to be preening himself in front of the mirror.
I get that down to about 10 seconds.
Yeah. You give me both, brother. Well, look, so that helps us with the verse 13 to 15. That's the kind of paraphrase summary of the view you're highlighting. So I'm going to read verses 4 and 5 from your paraphrase, and then maybe make a comment or two about it. But then, can you riff off it for us? So,
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, for the sake of those listening, this is one of those podcasts where, if you want to get the most out of this, you're going to have to grab yourself a Bible, read 1 Corinthians 11 from 2 or 4 to the end of the section, verse 16, and then what Pastor Lusk has done is he's written an extended paraphrase which calls attention to how he's interpreting the different phrases within this text. So this is not now me reading the Bible, this is reading Rich's paraphrase. But to get the best out of this, if you really want to wrestle with this question, you've got to take it seriously. So grab a Bible, press pause on this, and then sit down. And this is what Rich is saying from verse 4. Here goes. Anyone who prays or prophesies in the church's liturgical assembly, context, with his head covered, like an old covenant priest with a mitre, like a hat or long hair, dishonors his head, that is Christ, because he treats Christ's priestly ministry as incomplete and ineffectual, as if there were still a veil between us and God. Verse 5, and if a woman or wife were to pray or prophesy in the liturgical assembly with her head uncovered, that is, with her hair cut short, she would dishonor her head, that is, her husband, since it is the same as if her head were shaven, which is shameful. Her attempt to look like a man and lead the assembly like a man would be a sign that she's in rebellion against her husband's headship and wants to displace him, much like Eve did to Adam in the Garden of Eden. So, a couple of comments here. Maybe I raise up something in verse 4, which I think is a fascinating example of how to do exegesis well. Is what you've done, Rich, and I know you're drawing on other sources here, but it's really helpful, is you are paying attention to the things that weren't the question that everyone comes to this passage asking. Because you want to have a coherent view of the whole thing. You're not going to cherry pick the verse that says what you want it to say. You've got to make sense not just of what the covering is on the woman's head and why, but what the absence of the covering on the man's head is all about and why. So just unpack the logic of that for us. You mentioned head covered, old covenant priest, Christ's priestly ministry incomplete. What on earth's going on there? And how do you make sense of verse 4?
Well, it is interesting because for the old covenant priest, there was a head covering for the priest as he ministered in the presence of God. And so now, obviously, that's gone away. And so you have to ask the question, why? And I don't claim to have the definitive answer on this. I think this is a challenging passage. I think, as much as there is disagreement about this passage, one thing that everybody should agree on about this passage is that it is very difficult. And it's difficult because I think, and the reason I did the paraphrase is because I think it's one of those passages where so much of what you need to understand it is not said in this text itself. You have to draw on other parts of Scripture in order to really make sense of what's going on here. Now, obviously, Paul makes his appeal elsewhere to the creation account, as I said. So you got to go back to that and understand that and bring that with you to this passage. But here too, I think you've got to bring something from the Old Covenant order, from the Old Covenant system. And so I take the priest's head covering to be a kind of, so you think about the Old Covenant tabernacle and temple, they had veils, and those veils were protective to protect the people from the radiant glory of God that might otherwise consume them. So you think of, so I think that the priest's head covering is like an additional layer of protection, so it is an additional veil, if you will, that comes between him and God, because he needs that protection if he's going to minister in God's presence. Well, when Jesus dies on the cross, the veil is torn.
Right.
And so now we have access. And so now we, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, with unveiled faces or with uncovered heads, we could say, behold the glory of Christ. And so there has this is part of the shift from Old Covenant to New Covenant, is that we no longer worship God at a distance. In New Covenant worship, think about Hebrews chapter 10, which I think is talking about worship. We draw near through the torn veil. We draw near to God's heavenly throne in the heavenly sanctuary, the true most holy place. And I think so. I think all of this ties in with that, and so it's really interesting. You have, for example, in the Roman Catholic Church, a big deal made out of, for example, the Pope or bishops' head coverings, and I actually think that that's a violation of this passage. I do think that there's a kind of custom we have that when you come into a house of worship, if you're a man wearing a ball cap, you take off your ball cap. Because it's just as a sign, which is probably done more as a sign of honor or reverence than anything. But I think there's also a deeply correct intuition about that there are no more veils between us and God in that sense.
Right.
So
it's interesting.
I think that's what's going on there.
So an old covenant priest expresses his faith in God's holiness by covering his head. A new covenant worshipper expresses his faith in God's finished work in Christ on the cross by celebrating with unveiled head.
Absolutely.
But we can come in without a head covering. We don't need to be afraid of the serpent crusher crushing our head, because the serpent crusher has been crushed for us.
Exactly.
So you get to verse 5 then, and here what you're understanding this as okay, so picking up what you said previously, if a woman or a wife were to go ahead and pray or prophesy, what she'd effectively have to do would be to pretend to be a man by the way she cut her hair short, and that'd be disgraceful. It might as well shave your head, and everyone knows that's disgraceful, and so on.
Right.
So
it's kind of a sarcastic comment, like why don't you
okay. It's like a reductio ad absurdum. Like it's almost like the way in which the logic works in Galatians. They might as well go the whole way and emasculate themselves.
Don't stop the
Philippians.
Just castrate yourself.
Yeah. And so just say a word or two about the pray or prophesy. I'd mentioned this in a previous podcast, but we readily make the assumption here that what is that the activity in view is participating in the worship service.
Yeah, I don't think that
Here,
can be
Paul
it.
actually doesn't say that. He says praise or prophesies. What do you think is going on there, or what might be going on there?
Well, this is a little bit tricky here. The word prayer could be a way of covering everything that happens in the divine service.
Right.
Yeah, the Book of Common Prayer, the whole liturgy is a prayer, and obviously everybody's going to participate in it. And if that's all we had here, maybe you could go that direction with it. But he says prophesying also. Prophesying is an act of leadership in the context of the assembly. When you are prophesying, you're the only one prophesying and everyone else is listening to you. So you are de facto in a position of leadership. And I would actually take prayer here to be the same kind of way, the same kind of thing. It's got to be an act of liturgical leadership. It's not the common prayer. So again, Book of Common Prayer, think of it that way. It's not the common prayer that everybody in the assembly is sharing in. I think he's talking specifically about liturgical leadership. I think he's talking about specifically somebody who is leading the assembly as a whole. And that's something that, for reasons I've already given, we know those kinds of activities are forbidden for women in that context. Now, obviously, women are going to participate in the common prayer, the corporate prayer that is the liturgy. And you have women in the New Testament context during the apostolic era of the church who have the gift of prophecy. But they didn't prophesy in the context of the liturgical assembly. They used their prophetic gifts elsewhere, and that's I think very significant. So we don't have women. So throughout the New Testament, one thing that's very, very clear: there are obviously no priestesses, no women pastors, and I don't think that women are called in any way, shape, or form to take on positions or roles of liturgical leadership. So it's not just about the office. It's not just, well, a woman can't be a pastor, but she can preach a sermon that's not as official. Or a woman can't be a pastor, but she can lead the assembly in prayer. She can lead the pastoral prayer on a Sunday morning. I think Paul's going further than that. It's not just the office that's prohibited. It's certain leadership activities that perhaps might have been open to other not-ordained lay men in the congregation in certain contexts. So I think that's part of what's going on here. And again, this is grounded in who we are as men and women and the particular roles that God has called us to play.
Right. I want to read the next section of your paraphrase, Rich, and we'll get all the way down to verse 10. And everyone wants to know, everyone is asking, what's with the angels? And so we're going to have the canonical answer from Pastor Lusk.
I'll
you ready?
give you my thought.
All right. So again, this is just your paraphrase. And again, if you've got your Bibles, then you're following from verse 6. If a woman or a wife will not cover her head with long hair, then she should be shorn of her hair to humiliate her. But since everyone knows it's disgraceful and shameful for a woman or wife to be shorn or shaven, let her keep her head covered with long hair, and thus let her refrain from leading the assembly in praying or prophesying, since women are not permitted to lead the assembly by speaking, but should remain silent. And there you refer to 1 Corinthians 14, 33 to 35. Very important text. Verse 7. For a man ought not to cover his head with a head covering or long hair, since he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man under his headship. For man was not made from woman, but woman from and after the man. That's verse 8, and you're drawing on the creational background you mentioned previously. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man to be his helper. Again, verse 9, creational background. That is why a woman or wife ought to have, and you've graciously interposed the phrase.
The translators themselves have done a kind of paraphrase here by inserting the word symbol. I kind of accepted that. It's obviously debatable.
Yeah. So, and those of you who've heard me talk about this previously will know it says, that is why a woman ought to have authority on her head. And actually, since early times in the church, that was interpreted as a symbol of authority on her head. But just to highlight the complexity of the text, it doesn't actually say that. But the way you understand it, Rich, is that's why a woman or wife ought to have a symbol of her husband's authority on her head, because of the angels who are present in the gathered assembly and who are jealous that God's creational order be preserved, since a fallen angel, Satan, led the woman and the man to rebel against this order in Genesis 3. Now, that last phrase, again, this is an example of how to do exegesis well. We have to come up with some explanation that at least attempts to account for the difficult bits. We can't just leave the difficult bits off to the side, because a failure to wrestle with them might mean that the rest of our interpretation doesn't work either, and we're just ignoring the bit that throws the grit in the gears. So you've highlighted, because of the angels who are present in the gathered assembly and who are jealous that God's creational order be preserved, since a fallen angel, Satan, led the woman and the man to rebel against this order in Genesis 3. I know you have to go in about 4 minutes, so give us a bit of a riff on that, and that might be all we have time for.
So I mentioned earlier, what is the context of this passage? Is it a worship service or not? Is it an official gathering of the church or not? I take that it is, and this I would take as confirmation of that, because when we gather for worship, and again, this is where you're bringing all kinds of other exegetical gleanings from the rest of Scripture into our reading of this text, but in worship, we do ascend into the heavenlies. We have what's called an ascension offering in the worship service. We ascend into the heavenly sanctuary, and we are, as the ancient liturgical form has it, in the presence of angels, archangels, and all the company of heaven. There are some who think angels here just means messengers, and maybe it means pastors. And you can make an argument for that. I mean, there are good arguments to be made for the angels of the 7 churches in Revelation 2 and 3 to be the pastors of those churches. Mm-hmm. And you could take angels in that way here. I don't think it would change a whole lot in terms of my overall argument, but I just will let angels be angels, and I will point to the fact that in gathered worship, we do come into the heavenly sanctuary, and so we are in the presence of angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. Hebrews 12 affirms that. You have come to the heavenly Mount Zion, to, what does he say, innumerable angels, to the spirits of just men made perfect. So we're even in the presence of the departed saints in some sense. Doesn't mean we can talk to them, but we're somehow in their presence in gathered worship. And so that's the context. And I think what that does is it pushes you back to other places in Scripture from which we develop our whole theology of worship. So really starting with Genesis chapter 2, because the Garden of Eden is the sanctuary. It's the original sanctuary. As I said, Adam's the original pastor. She's the original congregation. And the trees at the center are sacramental trees. One is forbidden for now. The other they have access to. And of course, we know how that went. They went to the one that was forbidden. So I think all of that is kind of built into this. The whole thing, I'll just go back to what you said about verse 10. The whole thing about a woman having a symbol of authority, of her husband's authority on her head. Yeah, I'm probably kind of like the translators who have inserted that language of symbolism there. I'm not totally comfortable with it, but I also understand why it's done, because it does seem that that's something that is there's something like that going on in this text. And I would say that symbol is her long hair. She is her husband's glory. The woman has a glory that the man does not. And that's so important to understand, because people want to, I'll say a couple other things about this in just a minute to kind of wrap this up. But this I think is another significant element of this. The woman has a glory that the man does not. And the fact that she is not put in a position of liturgical leadership does not detract from that glory. So I think that symbol of authority is her longer hair. And I think glory in a way is interchangeable with authority there. It's a sign of her husband's glory. So I think that's part of what's going on there. A couple of things that I want to say to kind of bring this plane in for a landing, because this is a complicated passage, obviously. And maybe what we should do is post the link to where I've got this paraphrase so people can look at it.
Yeah, I'll certainly do that.
And if they want to just kind of work their way through it a little more slowly. Sometimes it's easier to kind of read through something and kind of cogitate on it some. But a couple things. I think that I think those who are seeking to insist on an artificial head covering in the context of the church today, even though I don't think this passage requires that, I think they are well-intentioned. And I think part of the intention is they see the havoc that feminism has wrought in our culture. They want to push back against feminism, and they see this as a way to do so. And I do think that's well intentioned, because I do think feminism is a really large problem, and it's sadly even encroached in many churches, evangelical and Reformed churches. Right. However, I don't think bringing back artificial head coverings is some kind of silver bullet that's going to defeat feminism. I don't think it's that simple. And so I can appreciate the intention. I don't think that's the right understanding, but I'm happy to leave that particular application of this passage as adiaphora in the life of the local church.
Right. No, it's really helpful. And just my own reflection on verse 10, which I'll be very clear has been helped by your exposition of it. I think verse 10 really strongly supports the hair as the covering reading. And one way to start with that is because of the angels. Who are the angels? Well, in Revelation, there are clear indications in the context that the angels are pastors, because you're writing letters to them. You can't really write a letter to an angel. But here there are clear indications in the context of creational backgrounds from Genesis in which angels are prominent, especially Satan, whom you mentioned. And once you've said that, given the absence, especially given the absence of the explicit word for a symbol or a covering, the woman ought to have authority on her head. That has to have reference to something which would have been present, your point from earlier, in the garden. Exactly. How is it that Eve would have been distinguished as rightly relating to Adam, and Adam distinguished as rightly relating to her, if everything had gone well, as it might have done for the first 5 minutes? Well, one way is by the distinctive created differences, which we still recognize, does not nature itself teach, manifested in the fact that the woman has long hair and the man has short hair.
Yeah.
That fits together in a way that other readings don't. And I think it's one of the helpful things that your exegesis calls attention to.
Wonderful. I think that's a great point. Yeah, that's exactly
final thoughts for us, Pastor Lusk.
Yeah, well, so again, I mean, God has created men and women with their own peculiar glories, and those do need to be expressed. And not only that, but there's a kind of interdependence that he gets at in this passage too, where obviously men and women are dependent upon one another, and God has made man, male and female, because, well, obviously for several reasons, but we do need each other. And in the union of male and female, God has given us the clearest possible created symbol of his relationship with his people, of Christ's relationship with his people. And that's a glorious thing. And those distinctions between men and women do need to come to expression in all kinds of ways. We live in a culture that is in all kinds of ways has sort of pushed androgyny on us. And that is a huge problem. And so we do need to resist that. There are wise and unwise ways of resisting what the world is doing. But we don't want to be conformed to the pattern of this world. We want to be conformed to the pattern of God's creation design and also God's redemptive purposes. And so, yes, we do need to distinguish men and women. We need to have culturally appropriate ways of expressing those creational differences. And I think that's really more than anything what this passage is getting at. And the overriding concern here in terms of those differences is the role that men and women can play within the service and hair length.
Pastor Rich Lusk, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
God bless.